In 1968, the University of California Press published The Teachings of Don Juan, a Yaqui way of knowledge. It introduced a series of Socratic dialogues into an academic landscape that prioritized clinical detachment. The author, Carlos Castaneda, was a graduate student in anthropology at UCLA. The prevailing academic mindset of the era was Cartesian, a philosophy based on the dualism of mind and matter, which demanded strict categorization and objective distance from the subject of study. Castaneda took this rigid framework into the Sonoran Desert. Here, the expansive, rugged terrain does not easily fit into a Western taxonomic grid. In this environment, he encountered Don Juan Matus, an elder of the Yaqui, an indigenous nation native to northern Mexico. Castaneda began his fieldwork assuming he could remain a detached observer, cataloging Don Juan's knowledge like a botanical specimen. But the text documents an encounter between Western reason and an active system designed to dismantle that reason through direct experience. The 1960s counterculture adopted the text as a psychedelic manual. In this interpretation, the book's complex protocols were reduced to a guide for recreational escapism. The ensuing media attention and New Age mythology obscured the book's specific academic and philosophical arguments. Don Juan's text outlines a highly pragmatic cognitive system, a series of utilitarian protocols designed to manipulate perception rather than find spiritual peace. To understand the work, we must move past the pop culture imagery and analyze the actual methodological architecture of Castaneda's training. Within the text, shamanic training is presented as a rigorous discipline, distinct from the unstructured escapism of 1960s drug culture. Castaneda initially approached Don Juan as an ethnobotanist, seeking an informant on medicinal herbs. Don Juan introduced 3 specific botanical tools. The first was peyote, which Don Juan framed as Mescalito, a teacher entity that required strict moral adherence. The second was datura, or devil's weed, described in the text as an unpredictable, power-granting ally. The third was psilocybe mushrooms, or humito, used to induce a state of altered perception that Don Juan called the little smoke. Critics have noted inconsistencies here, specifically that Castaneda describes smoking the mushrooms, a method that would chemically destroy the psilocybin. However, in the context of the internal epistemology, the literal chemistry is secondary to the psychological effect described. The plants functioned as mechanical shock vectors. Their purpose was to apply enough psychological pressure to break a stubbornly rational worldview. This leads to the core concept, the description of the world. This is the idea that our everyday reality is a socially conditioned construct we mistake for objective truth. Because this description is self-reinforcing, rational arguments or philosophical debates often fail to dislodge it. The psychotropic plants act as chemical vectors that bypass these cognitive filters, creating a direct breach in the practitioner's logic. Castaneda was subjected to this chemical method because his academic training made him particularly resistant to verbal instruction. This process involves the risk of psychological instability.
Removing the logical description of the world without a replacement framework leads to losing functional reality. To survive this, the apprentice must develop specific traits. The first is unbending intent, a focused commitment to the path that does not allow for hesitation. The second is the eradication of impatience. Every action must be performed with meticulous, deliberate timing. The third is assuming absolute responsibility for one's actions. In this system, there is no room for the luxury of regret. Dissolving the perceptual barrier is non-functional without this behavioral discipline. Without an anchor, the chemical shock leads to disorientation rather than knowledge. Once the everyday description of the world is fractured, the practitioner encounters the 4 natural enemies. The first enemy is fear. The initial experience of the unknown creates a paralyzing terror that often halts progress entirely. Fear is managed by acting in spite of it. The practitioner must move forward with the knowledge that the fear never truly disappears. The second enemy is clarity. Defeating fear provides a false sense of mastery. The practitioner becomes blinded by their own successes and stops questioning their perception. To defeat clarity, the apprentice must recognize that their insights are only temporary perspectives, not absolute truths. Surviving these first 2 enemies marks a shift in orientation. The practitioner moves from being a reactive subject to a proactive yet vulnerable warrior. The third enemy is power. It offers the ability to command the environment, which often leads to capricious tyranny. This is countered by sobriety. The warrior must realize their power is a temporary channel, not a personal possession. The final enemy is old age, an existential weariness that comes from decades of constant discipline and battle. Unlike the previous enemies, this one cannot be defeated. It can only be delayed.
The warrior's final act is to hold off this fatigue long enough to perform one last impeccable action before the end. The path of knowledge is presented not as a state of enlightenment, but as an ongoing war of attrition. By the end of his initial apprenticeship, Castaneda's narrative shifts. Don Juan declares the use of psychotropic plants is no longer necessary. The logic of his previous life no longer provides a complete explanation for his experiences. His dependence on chemical aids has reached its limit. He has reached a stage where perception is manipulated through internal intent rather than external substances. Castaneda is no longer a dependent observer. He is now responsible for the stability of his own perception. The psychotropic phase is revealed as a temporary, violent initiation designed to force open a perceptual door that can now be accessed through discipline. This transition sets the stage for the second book in the series, A Separate Reality. The warrior's new objective is seeing, the direct, sober perception of the energy that makes up the world, bypassing the need for hallucinogenic shock. To stay grounded, the practitioner adopts controlled folly, the technique of acting in the world while knowing that every action is ultimately just a chosen gesture. The plants were a means to an end. The actual work begins in the cold, sober reality of the Nagual.